the Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Charlene Spretnak. Charlene is a prolific author and theorist with decades of work published in multiple fields. In fact, she was one of the initial theorists of the women's spirituality movement in the 1970s and was co-founder of the Green Party movement in the U.S. in the 1980s. In 2006, she was named by the Environment Department of the British government one of the 100 eco-heroes of all time. In 2012, she received the Demeter Award for Lifetime Achievement as one of the premier visionary feminist thinkers of our time from the Association for the Study of Women in Mythology. The way that Charlene and her work came into my life was through a revolutionary book she wrote in the late 70s that I only discovered just a few years ago, called Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, a collection of pre-Hellenic myths. So for thousands of years before the classical myths were recorded by Hesiod and Homer, the goddess was the focus of religion and culture. In Lost Goddesses, Charlene recreates the original goddess-centered myths and illuminates the contemporary emergence of a spirituality based on embeddedness in nature. Her work, along with that of archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, inspired a speech I wrote called Learning to See in the Dark, Reclaiming Our Power, Transforming Our World. It appears as episode 64 on the Numinous Podcast. It is an episode in which I do a ton of swearing. This particular interview with Charlene is for those of you who prefer not to have the explicit version of this content. Charlene is also the author of a barn burner of an essay, if an essay published in the Journal of Archaeomythology could ever be considered a barn burner. But it precisely and methodically charts the machinations behind the scenes in the academic world of a very systematic campaign to discredit the work of Maria Gimbutas, who had theorized that patriarchy has not always been the only mode of societal functioning in human civilization. Maria Gimbutas and her decades of research and evidence showed matrifocal societies in old Europe from at least about 10,000 BCE to 2000 BCE. So it's one of my favorite essays I've ever read. Misogyny in Academia, Quelle Surprise. Anyway, I highly recommend it to you if you, like me, are a bit of a nerd about that kind of thing. I was super excited and rather nervous when Charlene accepted the invitation to be on the show. I'm delighted that she agreed to come on. I connected with Charlene over the phone. She was at home in Ojai, California. So Charlene, what identities do you lead with?
The way I think of my identity in the world is that it draws from three, at least, maybe that would be four, sources. I'm deeply interested in, I guess what I would call femaleness, the way I think patriarchal culture distorts so much of women's natural relational way of being in the world, that the women's movement was extremely compelling to me from the get-go. And that's partially because the second area would be a deep interest in the natural world and ecological thinking, which is also relational. I spent my parts of 11 summers when I was young, from age 8 to 18, in a girls' camp down in the southeastern hills of Ohio, the Hocking Hills, which is where the Appalachians start to roll, and it's very beautiful, wild, unglaciated land. And from that experience, my formative years then or parts of it, were spent in this immersion in nature and in a society run by women. So I had this model of feeling really in a cellular way that everything is connected the way you do feel when you live in nature for an extended time, and also this model that women could do everything. It was like a little world. Women ran everything. Then when I go back up to the city after camp, of course the messages were the opposite. It was the 50s and early 60s. No, women can't do anything. So I have that sort of eco-feminist orientation, which is deep for me. And then religion, spirituality would be a third source that I feel flows into me. I was raised Catholic, and my mother and her mother had a deep connection with the Virgin Mary, and that's important to me. And then I connected with Vipassana insight meditation, and I've studied Native American spirituality of different kinds, and really comparative religion of many different kinds. And of course, that's why when I realized there were these lost, hidden chapters of religion that were very matrifocal or matricentric, I was immediately fascinated with that and wanted to know more. So the other source would be political. I'm very concerned about eco-social justice, putting the two together, an eco-social analysis and vision, which is why I got interested in the Green parties when they were starting up in Europe, and then was one of the people who started it over here. So, yeah, those are all my touchstones, and it all just seems to work fine for me and blend together. I know it might seem like a mishmash, but feels very harmonious to me.
Mm-hmm. They sound like very strong pillars. You mentioned your growing up years, your childhood and your teens, and I'm curious when it is that you remember you first became interested in the Hellenic goddesses, and sort of the next piece would be, when did you realize that they had backstories, that there were earlier, more matrifocal versions of these stories?
Uh-huh. Well, I learned about the Olympian Greek myths in high school and in college, and I wasn't particularly drawn to them. I thought they were interesting as cultural history. I'm very interested in cultural history. But then in 1972, the mass market paperback edition of The First Sex came out. And this is a book written by a librarian in Florida, Elizabeth Gould Davis. And she called it that because Simone de Beauvoir had named her book in the early 50s, The Second Sex, Women Are the Second Sex. And so Elizabeth Gould Davis said, no, according to, the earliest history in Europe and elsewhere, we actually were the focus of cultural history. The societies noticed this, I would say, elemental power of the female. Lots of societies thought women were impregnated by spirits or the wind, or paternity wasn't recognized for a long time, and that's why anthropologists say that the earliest cultures were the mother, and a lot of anthropologists, certainly not all, the oldest standing couple is not the husband and the wife, it's the mother and the child. And in so many cultures, your lineage is traced through the matrilineal line, and a family is a woman and her brothers, and I won't go into this. There are a lot of books of cultures in the world today that have still existed with those lines. So anyway, cultures noticed that women had this elemental power. They could bleed in rhythm with the moon. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
They could swell up like the full moon, and then they could pull out of their body both females or males, and then they could transform food into this special kind of milk that kept these babies alive, so there was a next generation. So, they noticed this correspondence, the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the women's bodies, and the fecundity. And so there were many then spiritual, cultural expressions of sort of these cosmological powers in women and nature. So that's why she's saying, you can make the case. But she went and found all kinds of clues of goddesses and other female-centric expressions that were not in our textbooks of Western history of the West. And she made some leaps. I could see that, even though it was the first kind of book like that I'd read. But I thought, if even 1/4 of what she's saying is true, this is amazing. Why doesn't anyone know this? And I remember driving back from a Vipassana meditation retreat. I was living in Illinois then, and I was with two women friends in a VW Bug driving. It was in New Mexico, so we're driving back to Illinois from New Mexico, and I was sitting in the back seat reading the first section. I remember just yelling over the engine noise, which was considerable. Wow, listen to this. This is just amazing. So because of that book I read in 1972, later when I moved to Berkeley, I saw a flyer on Telegraph Avenue that Hallie Eigelhart had put up, that she was going to teach a gathering, a workshop in her home about early goddess cultures, and her special interest also was people developing a personal mythology once they had this information. So I thought, wow, I know something about this, So I went to that, and that was wonderful to connect with other people who were interested in the research. And then the third impetus was that my daughter, who was, she was about three or four, we were driving in the car, and she saw a picture of a horse with wings. It was that logo for Marathon Oil, which I think is not around anymore. But she said, Mama, look, there's a horse with wings. And I said, oh, yes, his name is Pegasus. And he's part of a very old story. They're called myths, and they're very, very old. And we could get a book of myths, and I'll read them to you. So we went to the Berkeley Public Library to get something suitable. And the only books on the shelves were the Olympian versions, where, the women were really trouble. They were the jealous, bitchy wife that Hera was made into, or Pandora, who opens the box and lets out pestilence and plague and suffering into the world. And I thought, oh, no, this is not what I'm going to read to my daughter. And besides, where's the older version? By that time, I knew there was a much older kind of mythology in Greece. So that's when I set out to write Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, to have that book on my shelf to be able to read to her, because it was not available. And I then did a lot of research in the classics library on the campus at UC Berkeley, and worked with showed it to this one quite well-known professor who was visiting there for a year from Switzerland, and he was very interested and encouraging. And I tried to piece together, for the first time in about 2,500 years, what the stories were of the earlier pre-Olympian goddesses, because their altars are much older than the altars in Greece to the male gods. And there's all kinds of evidence linking a practice to their religion, their spirituality of these goddesses before the patriarchal system came in. The patriarchal system came into southeastern Europe and elsewhere in Eastern Europe then as migrations moved off the Eurasian steppes, out of Russia, off the steppes. And they were nomadic patriarchal horsemen who, were focused on, horsemanship, weapons. They had the sun god. They didn't think the earth was sacred. They were focused on the sun god, lightning bolt. What art they had, which was not very advanced, went into the making and decorating of weapons, and their idea of the honorable death was to be killed in battle, symbolizing this thunderbolt of the sky god. So they moved into southeastern Europe and Greece and the islands, and there was already an indigenous religion there, a matrifocal religion with several different goddesses in different places of Greece. And the horse was extinct by that time in Europe, so when they came rolling in on horses, it was like tanks, They definitely dominated and conquered right away without much problem. And then, as conquerors do, they got to rewrite history, and they didn't just forbid people to ever mention the name of these goddesses. Rather, they incorporated them into their system of a sky god-focused Olympus, Zeus on top of Mount Olympus with his thunderbolt. And the goddesses' names stayed the same, but they completely changed their characteristics and made them very subordinate, and either they were quiet and didn't cause much problems, or they were the source of problems for the mortals, according to their story. So that's how I came to know there was this older layer, which I think is so important for us to know about.
Absolutely.
Because so many people say, oh, if you want to know the earliest expression of the female character, we can go to the Olympian myths, and we'll read about bitchy, jealous Hera and all these others. And I said, well, that's hardly the earliest. That's a late overlay, as the great classicist Jane Ellen Harrison said in around 1903. That's a very late overlay on top of the deeper, richer stratum that was matrifocal.
Well, and it's at once heartbreaking and heartening to learn this. I remember when I first discovered your book, which came out of your research, and so I guess that was about 1980 or 1981, Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, a collection of pre-Hellenic myths. I both cried and rejoiced because, I spent my whole childhood loving these myths, but not realizing how I was being conditioned to see myself, to see other women, to see relationships, to see our roles. And so to realize that there was something earlier, it was like oxygen to me, because that is the relationship amongst women I recognize. That's the power that I feel within myself. That's the story that seemed to be more resonant and parallel with my experience. And I started to really focus on just how unflattering, if we could just put it that way, the portrayals in the myths are of women in general. And as a person who's seeking to reclaim myth and to help people find their personal myth, I have, teachers that I've very much respected. When I have brought up to them, where are the women in your stories? And they sort of go like, oh, you're just sort of trying to divide us. These are universal. And I have not been able to find anyone who can really hear that no, that I love Joseph Campbell, but the hero's journey is not universal, and it's not the only myth. The monomyth is like, the sound of it is so arrogant to me that I know that there's some reason why I've resisted it my whole life. And here is some evidence that shows that. So I'm really curious about, in your research. So first of all, I just want to say, and I'll say it several times, this book, Lost Goddesses, has been so transformative for me. And it's a small book. You can read it to children. You can read it, at any age. And the introduction is absolutely a phenomenal tour de force essay. It was so eye-opening and just made me it's very fist pumping to read as a woman. I think I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if there were any goddesses with maybe interesting backstories or partial stories that didn't either make it into the book, or maybe they were from a different culture that you've come across where, we might be, we have a cultural idea or we've received some sort of prevailing wisdom about what that goddess is about that you discovered was untrue? Or was there anything on the cutting room floor that didn't make it into the book that still kind of niggles at you?
No, really the problem was the opposite, that so little has survived. So I really worked to fit every bit of research, evidence about what these pre-Olympian goddesses had been associated with, what traits were associated with them, what flowers, what birds, what totemic animals, what activities. And that's the sad part, how little has survived, which, as I say in the introduction, as stories, these might seem odd to people. They don't have exciting plot development or character development. I didn't want to embellish them in that way. I wanted to just stick as closely as I could to the facts that have survived. The only myth in there with really a plot would be Demeter and Persephone, because the patriarchal one is so well known, and I think it builds on the earlier version. I'll explain that later. But so I guess, a friend of mine who's a classicist, the Professor Mara Keller, she once says, "Where's Brito Maris? Brito Maris from Eastern Crete should have been in there." I said, "Well, I know, but there wasn't enough that survived about her."
Right.
So,
Okay.
I suppose she's on the cutting room floor, but there just wasn't enough to work with.
Okay. So I have used the myths and retold them and read them to women on retreat with me, and I've used them a lot, and I fairly recently had the opportunity to write a speech for a conference, and I was drawing on what I called the dark woman archetype, which was these stories from many different cultures of women who were oriented towards, or their message or stories were oriented towards, rage or grief or, justice. And so I was talking about, Kali and to some extent Persephone. I was talking about those goddesses who go on underworld journeys and calling it the dark woman archetype. Now, in your introduction to Lost Goddesses, you have a section called The Problems with the Jungian Uses of Greek Goddess Mythology. I'd love for you to talk about what I'm calling the dark woman archetype, and maybe what I got wrong in my assessment of what she's about, or maybe what's problematic about archetypes in general, or sort of that Jungian approach by using the model of archetypes.
Right. Well, this section in the introduction I wrote because several books by Jungians came to my attention that were using these very negative, ugly depictions of women, and they were calling them the earliest expression of the female psyche. So, as I said, historically, I knew that wasn't right. Mm-hmm. One of them, there was a book called She, and it has a long subtitle to it. But anyway, it was books like that sort of spurred me to look at this. Well, by the way, that was a book called She, Understanding Feminine Psychology, subtitled An Interpretation Based on the Myth of Amour and Psyche and Using Jungian Psychological Concepts. So in it, the author said that this story is one of the best elucidations available, the psychology of the feminine personality, and he doesn't say it was, again, from this classical period. It's really not that early. But anyway, it says her archetype here, it says, is a primitive femininity with her chief characteristics. This is of Aphrodite he's talking about, the great Aphrodite. Her chief characteristics being vanity, conniving, lust, fertility, and tyranny when she is crossed. And I thought, I wrote, fertility among a string of negative adjectives, that's clinically interesting. But anyway, so that's why I started looking at that. And then I looked at the way Jung did not distinguish in the way von Neumann did between these two very different systems of mythology. You can't really talk about Greek mythology. Are you talking about the pre-Olympian or the Olympian system? Mm-hmm. So when he wrote that about his archetypes drawn from Greek mythology, he said, evil symbols are the witch, the dragon, or any, and this I think maybe is in general, he didn't mean only the Greek system. Evil symbols are the witch, the dragon, parenthesis, or any devouring or entwining animal such as a large fish or serpent, close parenthesis. This list is not, of course, complete. It represents only the most important features of the mother archetype. And I said, really? Or does it represent the most important features of the patriarchal archetype of the mother? Mm-hmm. Because witches, serpents, and dragons were never evil symbols in the older tradition. Mm-hmm. And for instance, of course, we know in the myth of Adam and Eve, that turned all the symbols from the older religion upside down. Mm-hmm. So the tree of wisdom was not a dangerous place, and the serpent shedding and renewing was a symbol of mm-hmm. the old religion. And mm-hmm. Christianity had to fight the pagan old religion throughout Europe, and they had the myth of St. George cutting off the head of the dragon, and it would keep growing back and growing back. Mm-hmm. So, this snake and the dragon are not just necessarily evil symbols connected with the mother archetype. And so anyway, I just point out that that's a problem with the way archetypes are framed. Mm. And I think people who are going to use the Jungian system need to look at that. It's very important to honor and make large in your consciousness the times when you have really stood up to that powerful patriarchal pressure coming at you. And I think everyone has those moments, but I have found that they don't have anywhere to fit in then daily life. They were aberrant, and the culture is so other mm-hmm. that they just sort of slip from memory. I've had so many women tell me, I haven't thought about this for decades or years or maybe even decades. I once, some it might have been a physical thing, guy was starting to threaten me, and I did something, and I've just blocked it out of my mind. And I thought, well, unless we take steps, that's what happens. It doesn't fit with the way we're socialized and the way we go through life. I'll give you an example to make this a little more concrete. In 1968, there was a lot going on in our country, mm-hmm. a lot of turmoil. The opposition to the Vietnam War was becoming very powerful. Why are we sacrificing all these young men over there? Why are we interfering with their civil war? Mm-hmm. because somebody has this theory, this falling dominoes theory, that if Vietnam goes communist, the whole world will go communist. So anti-war movement was picking up speed, and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June. And then there was the Chicago Convention, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August 1968. Eugene McCarthy had run in the primaries on the peace plank to make peace in Vietnam and get us out of there. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of us went to Chicago to support this peace plank and to demonstrate for getting a peace plank in the national platform of the Democratic Committee. And as you probably know, there was a police riot against the protesters, the anti-war protesters. And, it was very brutal. There was a big investigation later that said it definitely was a police riot run amok. And I was there on the Main Street, Michigan Avenue, with a friend of mine. And we moved down a side street, and we were, I don't know, a few dozen feet down the side street, and around the corner suddenly comes this group, like a platoon of the Chicago Tax Squad, and they had their nightsticks, their billy clubs, raised, and they were running right at us. And they had big boots on, masks, helmets, and I say this weapon raised in their hand, this club, and they were swinging at people. My friend got separated. He got pushed down into the gutter into the street and had his head split open in front. And they were coming just right at me, a few feet away from me. I was a 21-year-old young woman in sandals and a sundress. Mm-hmm. And this guy's a few feet away from me with all this equipment and this weapon coming right at me. And it was one of those few moments in life where words came out of my mind without going through the cognitive process. I didn't really think about it. But when he was just a few feet away from me, I just stared at him right into his eyes, and I said, "You will let me out of here." And he just froze. It's like, I don't know if he saw his mother or his grandmother or something. Just froze with his club up in the air. And then he shoved me into the brick wall, but not so too hard, got me out of the way and went clomping past with all his comrades down the block. Later on in my life, I encountered patriarchal force, institutional or groups of men, other things coming at me, and I was just kind of stunned by what was happening. And I look back and I think, now why was that? Because what was happening later, which is the typical thing women run into in patriarchal culture in many ways, just to silence and shut down women and get rid of them, that wasn't nearly as life-threatening as having a group of the Chicago Tax Squad running at you. Mm-hmm. But it had just sort of faded from memory because it didn't fit anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I think when we have those moments, we need to really incorporate that into our psyche. Think of yourself as she who shouted down the Chicago police force, the Chicago Tax Squad, she who stood up to the bullies armed. Mm-hmm. Mark that day, make your own liturgical calendar every time that date runs around, or keep a special sacred journal and write down all the times you did these almost surprisingly courageous things so they won't slip from memory and they become more and more part of who you are. Mm-hmm. What has been revealed to you come through you as who you are and what you can do, so that it is never lost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and you in Lost Goddesses, you describe the earlier
depictions of these goddesses are, you call them radically body honoring and nature oriented. When there is a violation of what ought to be body honoring or nature oriented is when we as women can feel so much rage, so much fury, but because in patriarchal culture we have nowhere to put that, we can feel impotent or voiceless. And like you said, there's when it does rise up and there's nowhere to put it, it is so outside the norm that I can definitely imagine that many of us forget those moments. We forget what we're made of. And just the same way that, when we live in an urban environment, we forget that, we don't go into nature. We came from nature. This is what we come from. And so there's sort of a shifting baseline that happens over time that we need to stop and arrest. And I want to just read a couple of lines again from the introduction and ask you a question based on this, because it seems very related. You say, a woman raised in a patriarchal culture is told that she has the wrong type of body-mind to be taken seriously and to share a sexual sameness with God. Patriarchal socialization tells her that the elemental power of the female is somewhat shameful, dirty, and downright dangerous if unrestrained. And I triple underlined downright dangerous if unrestrained, because of course that sounds super exciting and enticing to me. And so I wonder, you talked about an almost idyllic upbringing where women could do everything, where women were very capable. What do you imagine a society of unrestrained females might be like? I mean, and I don't mean this in a utopian sense, but I mean that feminism really is having a bit of a moment right now. And you've spent decades trying to dismantle patriarchy in your own way. But when you look around, like, where are we at now? Like, if we wanted to really harness the energy of the no longer compliant female, where would you say we should look? Is there any goddess that can teach us? Or are we needing to create new myths, as you're saying, with remembering this experience and charting something new? Like, where are you at with this in sort of that personal and political sense?
Mm-hmm. I think a really fruitful place to look is the work of the French feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray, because she seemed to solve the problem we're seeing now with this backlash against feminism. When you were speaking outside of the goddess Themis, the lawgiver, I think that if we were designing the society, there would be a lot more respect and care about the quality of relationships. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of men and women actually have a different moral code because they order the transgressions differently. Mm. So for women, like, one of the worst things is a relational violation of some sort. And for men, that's farther down the list. Oh, yeah, it's maybe not so important. Competition with another guy, that's the main thing at the top. So I think we actually are not quite in sync on that. And when we try to bring our values into society, women who become managers in nonprofits or businesses or agencies or whatever, educational institutions, then they often will get pushback, like we saw in this last election in the United States. Certainly, the men were saying, I would never vote for women for president, and basically I want you to all shut up, and I don't want to hear any more about this, the political correctness, as they say, which is really, some people say, should be defined as personal consideration. But so if we look at what Irigaray says, she's said we could have this dynamic culture of intersubjectivity, male subjectivity and female subjectivity, if only both halves were present. But the whole culture is an expression of male subjectivity, the way they see the world, the way they organize things, what feels comfortable to them. So all the language, the history, the way the institutions are set up, certainly the way the legal and political and business and educational systems are all set up. So she says women have to articulate our own experiential sense of all these societal questions and being in the world. And men need to respect that other half. They can't go on pretending that their half is the norm for all of humankind, because there are so many, as I say, psychological findings, that women and men often see things differently, especially on the relational issues. And I don't mean only personal relationships, also societal. So that's very interesting to me, because it undercuts the possibility for that backlash that just says, you're trying to shut me down, no, we're not. We're trying to bring the other half to the fore so we can have this dynamic conversation in society. And she's very radical about what it would mean for women to think through and invent certain linguistic concepts that aren't there now, and everything. A collection of her work, talks about her ideas for how apartments should be laid out, houses, certainly science, what politics would look like, education. So I think that's a very fruitful way to go. Everybody has their space, but there's a vacuum on our side in terms of what's there now in patriarchal culture. And so it's our moral responsibility to bring it forth, bring forth our experiential wisdom.
And where does that, this is a bit divergent, but where does that then, though, leave the men who, who did vote for Hillary? Where does that leave men who also are, patriarchy sucks for men in a lot of ways too. So how do we locate that, when we're sort of like, if we're taking kind of an intersectional approach here to go, what do we do to dismantle patriarchy? And we want to, we don't want to center comfort for men who are uncomfortable with dismantling patriarchy, but we also want to create more liberation for men who also can see, like, yeah, this is not how I perceive my mother or my wife. This is not how I want any woman to be treated. I'm also sick of body shaming. I'm also sick of destroying the planet. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. You've said, as a self-declared second wave feminism, where are you at with that piece about, like, patriarchy is the problem, and how do we step away from the it's men and it's a Mars and Venus problem, as they say. It's a men and women problem, and connect it more to systems of oppression that
Right.
really only work for a very narrow range of prosperous white males.
Right. And that's the branch of the second wave of feminism I was always situated in. The cultural feminists have said this is a problem with cultural history and the way the culture is structured, the societal problems. It's not that this is a biological knee-jerk reaction of every baby from the time they start growing up. So absolutely right. But again, to come back, Adigadai, I think, is so important there, because she'll say, a lot of feminists keep trying to change men. Can't you be nicer? Can't you be more relational? Can't you be less competitive? No, they can't. That's their natural way. They love to compete. It just feels right to them, so that's in their half. Just let them be like they are. But we have other things we want to articulate. And it takes both sides, saying you have to honor our side and that this is what's valid for us. And the men, since they have all the structure and power now really have to encourage this development. And I think, when you said that the men who wouldn't vote for Hillary, you say they'd never vote for women, everything is presented in this culture, in this binary choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do you want jobs or environmental protection?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want for the women to shut up or for you to never have any good jobs or positions again? It's manipulated to be an either-or choice that a lot of people fall for. So that has to be addressed and say, with the right vision, which is so sadly lacking in this last campaign, really on either side, you can really spark new thinking. Mm-hmm. But without the vision, without the deep vision, I don't think you will ever get that new thinking.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the election because, of course, it's, I'm in Canada and I was devastated. So, we definitely had some grief and some rage circles happening here. And knowing that, in your personal history, you were one of the founders of the U.S. Green Party. I can only imagine. I mean, I know that was, decades ago, but and so your political engagement has probably changed in the specifics of your role. But you did mention that one of your 4 foundational, pillars or identities is political. So I'd love to hear how this election has affected you personally and what you are doing personally and politically in light of how events unfolded.
Well, so many of us were devastated, as you say, and certainly Bernie Sanders was very close to green positions in a lot of what he was saying. So it was quite sad that he didn't win. And not only that, but in our system, it's treated like a sports event. If you get 49% of the votes instead of 51%, the person who gets just a little bit more than you doesn't have to pay a bit of attention to all the people who voted for your positions, which seems to be wrong to me. It's difficult to know what to do. Just this morning, though, I said to my husband, I just thought of something Bernie should do. Form a shadow cabinet. Because in Europe, the opposition will form a shadow cabinet. They're not elected, they're not official, but they're very experienced people who comment, have conferences, and the press covers it, their analysis of what's going on in the government. And the reason I think that's important is because last time we had an administration like this one shaping up to be, although nothing's really been like this one is going to be, apparently. But when President Reagan came in and then second President Bush, George W. Bush, it was just a full court press. They put their corporate people in at the head of every regulatory agency. They hated regulation. They shut down everything. They rolled back things. It was like people were dumbfounded. And there was so much going on in 20, 50 different areas at the same time, just devastation across the board in terms of protecting the public. That's what those regulations had been put in there for, that you couldn't really track everything that was going on. So, yes, there'll be these talking heads and pundits commenting on it, but that's like a flow of folk glut. If they had a shadow Secretary of Commerce and a shadow Secretary of State commenting with Bernie as the shadow president, I think that would be very helpful to focus the information so that's just one small thing. Of course, I think there's going to be a lot of mobilization.
When your political world and the societal atmosphere are tumultuous and chaotic like this, when it seems as though, patriarchy and, white supremacy, imperialism, all of these things that you've been fighting against, your whole life and trying to dismantle and enlighten and educate people about, when that is all in a chaotic state, what does that do to your spirituality personally? What becomes most important to you? What practices do you employ to keep your center and hold your ground?
Well, as I mentioned before, I've practiced Vipassana meditation since 1970, actually. And I think that's so important in tumultuous and upsetting times to be able to center yourself and not feel torn in so many directions and frazzled. And the version that's gone into American and probably Canadian culture called mindfulness takes the techniques out of Vipassana meditation without the spiritual framework. So I have my doubts about that. I know it's helped a lot of people, especially as it's been used in the health world for lowering blood pressure and anxiety and all that. But I think it's misunderstood because just a few days ago in the New York Times, they printed an essay in the Sunday Review section by this woman who said, I think this is the wrong idea, this mindfulness stuff and focusing on the present moment, and there are other ways that it can make you happier than that.
That was the article that
thought,
said, actually, let's
not
be in the moment.
Happy.
Right.
That's what you get when you have a sort of light version of it. You end up with a light result. So it's not about that. It's about, to come back to this idea that we are composed of and live in these endless fields of dynamic interrelatedness. That's how the whole biological, ecological, physical world, including humans, is structured and works from moment to moment. So when you are calm within yourself and the relationships are working optimally, say, even within your own system, your blood pressure, and are not in a state of high anxiety, you are then in this healthy way to be in the world. And that doesn't necessarily mean quietism and opting out of political action, as this essay indicated. So I think it's important for anything that you want to do personally or politically. When those times come, you just have to be able to find the technique that is going to center you and calm you, because then you're in the condition that's needed for everything to work. When you look at babies, what they need to grow, for their brains to grow, for everything to happen, is being in an unstressed state, an unstressed condition. And it's the same for us all the way through life. So I think that has everything to do with activism.
So I'm wondering, you mentioned the goddess Themis and as the lawgiver, and I'm wondering if when you locate ourselves in time and space and in North America at this time, do you think there's a particular goddess that would be helpful for us to ruminate on or to call in, or do you think that there's a particular goddess who might be on the rise right now that could be helpful in our activism?
Oh, I think that's really a personal choice,
So for you personally, do you have one that is kind of on your crew spiritually right now that you're drawing on for strength or inspiration?
Well, as I say, my formative great mother figure was the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, and I just think she's such an interesting figure because she's not a deity. She was a village woman, and in this spiritual story, she comes into her larger cosmological self. It's like she grows spiritually into becoming the Queen of Heaven, or you could say you have your small self and then your large self. I mean, our boundaries are not really the sack of skin that we're contained in because of this reality of dynamic interrelatedness. We're so interrelated with everything throughout the universe, really. So we have that small self and larger self, but we don't often get beyond the small self. So I just think her spiritual presence is, I'm sure it's my own version of it, not anything official, but very, very powerful.
Yeah, I like that point that she isn't a deity, but she develops in a kind of beyond the body, beyond the mind. She sort of, it's like a celestial self. She has this higher self, or this more as you say, this dynamic, interrelated self that we all get to see. We all get to hear the story of how she did that. I like the idea that we're witnessing her spiritual growth. That's a beautiful idea. I like that. Thank you. So this season, in the past on the Numinous podcast, I took the last question from the Proust questionnaire, and it was about happiness. But I've been really investigating and sitting with grief and rage for several months now. So I've shifted. So this season, we're learning from folks. How do you manage your own grief and cope with your own rage when you look around at the world these days?
Those two seem like such different emotions, grief and rage. I mean, grief is a deep sadness, which requires time, but also a reframing of what it is that you're grieving over. And rage is, I think, really calls out for, again, a reframing. But, often when we're in situations like that, we can only see it one way. So the reframing is you then begin to see different elements of what was going on from different directions, and that takes time, too.
So true. Well, this has been a really epic conversation. We've really covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you being on the show. And I realize that you have many other books that have been written. You are an expert on the relational universe. There's so much more I'd like to talk to you about, and I hope you'll come back on the show. But thank you for spending so much time with us today, Charlene.
Oh, my pleasure.
I love talking with the people who wrote my favorite books, and this was no exception. You can purchase all of Charlene's books on Amazon, of course, but she's been writing for decades, so your local bookstore is probably happy to order them in for you, and I found several copies at my local favorite secondhand bookseller here in Victoria, BC, Russell Books, 2 locations just blocks away on Fort and View Street. That is not an ad. I just love them and encourage people to buy secondhand. I want to thank Charlene for sharing so personally with me, and I want to thank you for spending time with us today. Today I want to give a shout out to my listeners, and I've been hiding the list from myself, so I'm surprised too. My listeners in the UK, but let's break this down. Let's say hi to the motherland, Scotland. Thank you to all the listeners in Scotland. I set an intention to bring my daughter back to you and let her see the land of our ancestors, maternal ancestors, in when she's 18. Very exciting. Thank you. Thank you for spending time listening to the show. As I mentioned at the start of the show, this podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development course. If you'd like to be notified when that reopens in June, hop onto my website and sign up for my newsletter. While you're there, you'll see I've posted the dates for my wilderness quests in 2017, May and August, you and me, 12 days in the mountains doing ritual and ceremony. Get all the details at carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.